Well, hey, welcome back. Now, as you can see, we are back on the green thing again. So it's here because of the knocking issue. To address that, we need to pull the transmission and rear end out of it. Now, Jeff's been planning for a while to put some lowering springs in this thing to drop it down a couple inches. And since we're going to have the rear end out, now is the perfect time to do it. So I believe what he got was a set of Posies front and rear reverse side springs. We're also going to do the front, and because it needs a little bit of front end work at the same time, we've got the front end completely out of it. So we're going to end up doing some kingpins in it. I think possibly a steering box. It's got the old style 7.2 steering box and it's pretty loose. So we're going to try to get that all squared away, put the reverse side spring in the front, knock a bunch of leaves out of that, and hopefully give this thing a little bit better stance. Now it's not going to sit quite as low as the coupe, but hopefully it'll at least get you out of the nosebleed section and get it a little bit closer to the ground. Well, I wasn't able to get the kingpins to come out easily. I'm going to get this spring off of here first, and then I can put this probably in the vise, make it a little easier to fight with. So with any luck, we'll actually be able to get the spring off of here. I don't know. They can fit, it will fit. The center pin's pretty rusty, so I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to get it out of there, or just have to cut it, or who knows. These things are all rusted to hell. I'm sure those aren't going to come off. Got to cut those. Turn it. Oh, broke. Even better. Even better. I like it. Perfect. Now if we can get that thing. So here's a good little tip. The center bolt breaks. See, that's why you put clamps on it. If that breaks, that just would have exploded and thrown springs everywhere. So now I'm going to disassemble that without an intact center bolt. It's not that hard to do. What you got to watch out for though is that center bolt catching on the leaves. If you just go pulling those things off, they'll probably come right off and you'll think, that's great. And that thing will still come apart on you. So loosen them up slowly, little each side. And when it seems like the springs aren't coming apart anymore, hit them with a hammer and then they'll start to come apart. That makes any sense. Now they'll let that center bolt, we'll kind of break that free from the, at least it's hung on. You should be able to start seeing some gaps in there, hopefully. Maybe. There goes there. Close. Get it off again. Yeah, I think we got it. Yep. Yeah, it's kind of warm still. So an easy way to get this thing apart, take a chunk of 2x4, stick it under each of the end shackles. You should be able to just pop that right off there. Actually, this may just come off. The spring is really long for some reason. It's pretty weird. So the old spring is off and the new spring is on. This is a Posies reverse side spring. I think we left one leaf out of it. It's kind of a trial and error thing when you put these things together. You have to put it in the vehicle, just see how it sits. Sometimes you gotta give it some time to settle too. It may end up lower after a little while than what you initially set it up as, so it's good to go a little bit high on it. Leave it a ½ inch high and just let it settle. Give it a season of driving and just see where it sits before you make your final decision. So when you do remove leaves, and this goes for whether you're using a stock spring pack or an aftermarket one, you need to add something on the bottom to take up the slack inside the cross member here. Now this is however high, and your plate goes on the bottom there. It needs to be able to sandwich that and hit the spring here and not hit the cross member. Because if you don't have enough leaves and it's hitting the cross member, it'll allow the whole spring pack to move inside the cross member, and that is not good. The thing will handle like a nightmare at that point. So right now I just have these random leaves that I had kicking around to take up the space. Usually I'll cut them down so that they're not much bigger than the size of the plate there, just so they don't look so out of place. You really aren't going to notice anyway, but we'll see how this thing sits. And if this is big enough to fit in there and sits all right, we may just cut these down and we'll call it good then. But we also ended up going with, those are Pete and Jake's shackles. Now they have a few different options. With this one, the eye on the spring was actually a different diameter than the eye on the perch. So this came with 2 different size bushings. These are the poly bushings. And when you use that on these perches, you need to remove the original steel bushing. And those can be kind of a nightmare, especially if they've been there for a long time. The chances of you being able to just drive those out are pretty slim. So here's how I usually get those out. So I didn't think to film this while we were actually doing it, so we'll do a quick reenactment here to show you, I wouldn't say easy, but an easier way to get the bushing out of here. Now it's kind of hard to see that there even is a bushing in there, but there is, and it's pretty small. Oftentimes they're really worn on the bottom. I've seen them before where they're worn completely through. If that's the case, you can usually just drive out what's left of it because it's only like 3/4 of a circle at that point. Most of the time though, it's still completely intact, and trying to get a bushing driver and to get that out is probably not going to happen. They're really seized in there. So kind of the trick to doing that is take your hacksaw, take it apart, stick your blade through it like that, and put your saw back together. So now you can get in here and cut a groove in the bushing and make it a lot easier to get out. So the way I usually do it is I'll cut 2 grooves, anywhere between like 30 and 90 degrees apart. That way you end up with a small piece. I found it's easier to try to knock that small piece out. If you do a single groove, you're still, it does relieve some of the tension inside of this, but a lot of times they're kind of rust fused to this, and that single groove won't really do the trick. So if you do 2 grooves not far apart, that's what I did with, these are the ones that came out of the ones from the truck. So like right here, you can see on this bushing, did 2 cuts pretty close together. I usually try to do a little further apart than that, but I cut this little tiny piece out. Now it gives you a little bit more room to get in there with a punch. This one we did, a little bit further apart, and the same deal, it came out in 2 pieces. Once you do that, you can get in here with a punch and a small chisel and just try to catch that edge. Give it a few good hits and it should start to come out at that point. But if you're trying to fight with one of these things, this is definitely the best way to do it. You can do it with like a triangle file and go in there and cut the grooves that way, but this is probably the quickest way to do it. Just be careful you don't cut into the perch. You just got to keep an eye on it, keep checking it while you're doing a cut. You got to get completely through or it doesn't do you any good, but you obviously don't want to cut this. So with the front spring pretty much squared away, it's now time to dig into the back. We're going to get the rear end dropped out of this thing. Now, I'm doing several other repairs at the same time, so I haven't put the front end back in it. So as we finish up the other repairs and get this back together, we'll have a better idea as to how this thing's going to sit with these lowering springs in it. Pulling the whole rear end out, it is definitely way easier to unhook your brake rods from up in the front than it is to try to get them in the back, because it's really tight in the back. Trying to fight with the cotter pins up here, it's real easy to get at. Pull your cotter pins, pull your pins, plus your anti-rattle springy things are attached right to your radius rods anyway, so it's going to keep the rods on the rear end, so it's way easier to do it this way. That's all unhooked. We'll get the other side. So as you saw, we're getting ready to pull the rear U-bolts off. And something you definitely want to keep in mind with these, especially with the rear springs, because there's a ton of tension in these things. Inspect that center bolt before you go taking the U-bolts off. I don't know if I can get you in here that well to see it, but see how rotted the nut is on that? These U-bolts are probably all that's holding that spring together. If you take those off, there's a chance that that center bolt could let go. And if that happens when you're taking this out, that would be a very bad day. That is going to put the brakes on this for today. We're going to have to pull the bed off. We considered replacing the rear U-bolts anyway, because they're kind of crusty. And to do that, the bed has to come off. So now we're definitely taking the bed off. That way we can kind of get this thing clamped while we remove those, and you know, kind of systematically take this thing apart instead of having it explode while we're trying to take it out. So that is where we're at with that. But now we can get in here and get some big clamps around the cross member and around that spring pack. So when I take this thing apart, if that center bolt does let go, it won't go flying, because it would not be a good day if that happened. So I'm gonna dig out my big C clamps, get this thing set up. I'll probably just take this center bolt apart, because I mean, realistically, there's barely anything left of that nut anyways. So I'll probably just take that apart if it'll come apart. That way we don't have to worry about it later on. And I'll release this with the C clamps with it in the cross member, and should take care of it. If you haven't messed with these rear springs, these things are not a joke. They're not like, you know, newer car leaf springs where there's a tiny bit of tension on them. These things get ugly. You don't want to just pull them apart and let stuff fly. glowing now, that ought to come off. Good luck. Close, we got close, come on baby. Probably would have been easier just to cut it off at this point, but we're almost there. Before we go any further, I'm going to get these spring clamps off of here. Maybe. We will save and probably reuse those. I don't know if the new springs came with new ones or not, but I think he just put these on here pretty recently. So. So one thing to point out at this point, and I've kind of emphasized on it a little bit already, but it really can't be said enough, just how much tension is in this spring. If you try to undo this and don't have something to contain the spring, it'll actually lift the truck. Like if I get the rear end supported, it'll lift the frame of the truck right up off the rear end and knock it off the jack stands. So don't think that the weight of this, even if the bed was still on it, even if it was a full-bodied car, a four-door car, it's still not heavy enough to compress that spring. So if you undo this thinking that the car is going to hold it together, it's not. It's just going to lift the car. The other thing to keep in mind is if you have the front or rear end out, your jack stands are going to be more towards the center of the vehicle just to clear the wishbones and the radius rods. Now, like I said, there's very little weight in the back of this thing, obviously with the engine in it. All the weight's right here. Now you see where we had to put the jack stands to get the front end out of it. The engine is mostly in front of those jack stands, which means this thing is super front heavy. If you don't support it in front of the engine, when you take that rear end out, it will again do this. Pretty much guaranteed it'll nosedive off those stands. So make sure you support it up towards the end of the frame if there's no front end in it, or if you get the wheels in there, that'll put something under the wheels to hold it. But in a situation like this, you need to have something up here, or this thing will come off the stands. The other thing to keep in mind here is I already have the coupler off, so there's nothing holding this in the front. You don't want to let that torque tube come down and hit the floor because it'll dent the end of it and then it won't fit right. So I'm going to put a jack stand up into the front of that to support that just in case it decides to come back out. We don't smash up the floor. Now comes the fun part. So right now the U-bolts are still on here. Those are going to support this to some extent. So I'm going to let those out a little bit further. It's a good idea to use those as kind of a safety thing for as far as you can right now. Alright, take that a little further. start letting off these. Hopefully that spring will start to come apart. I would imagine that center bolt's going to hang up a little bit. But there's a whole lot of tension here to push those apart, so. Again, I'm putting the jack under it to support it, but if you don't let that jack down, it'll lift the truck off the jack, so that's not what we want. I'll put that down a little bit. Give me some room here. I'll start to put these down. I think that center bolt is hanging up. It's kind of what I was afraid of. Yeah, I think that's helping. A lot more tension on these now. There we go. Starting to come apart. I think what I might do is put a chain around here just in case. It's not going to stop it from coming apart if it does, but it'll keep things kind of contained. That'll limit how far things can go, if nothing else. I think it'll be alright. It was a good idea just to, in case. Make sure you keep an eye on that so the rear end doesn't hit it and you don't start springing up off of that. There's a lot of travel in these too. I mean, when these things are apart, there's like that much height to them, so it takes a while to get all the tension off. Yeah, even still it's trying to push up on that. I just let that down, you can see the frame drop a little bit. But it has definitely been apart before because that is not an original center bolt. You can see how it's round and slotted. That is not original to that. Another thing to note is the top leaf. These are beveled on the edges like this because the cross member is not perfectly square in the corners. So if you try to take one of these leaves and stick it up in there, it won't sit perfectly flat in here because the corners are going to catch. So if you're going to use a different top leaf, or if you're using an aftermarket spring pack that maybe doesn't have this, take your angle grinder and knock the corner off of that so it'll sit up in there nice and flush like that. And it's supposed to be a piece of welting, like your frame welting. Would have sat on top of this. That's probably what this is, or the remnants of that. It just keeps it from squeaking. It's not a huge deal one way or the other. Plus these things have sharp edges on them and they dig into the leaf underneath them if they're not maintained well. Yeah, it's got some real bad pitting right there. You can see on that where that one was digging in, wearing that leaf right out. So these are all going to get replaced anyway. We'll probably just make spacers out of these, you know, cut this much out of all of them. Save that so when we do leave some other vehicle, I have spacers to make it up. I have to use probably Probably 3 or 4 on this one to make up this height anyways. So. See if we can get the torque tube out of the transmission. There it is. I usually use one of those big moving dollies and put a couple of 4x4s on it, and it sits on there real nice. And you take a small one, put it under the front, and you can roll the whole thing around. But mine are all currently being used, so I guess we're just going to slide it around the floor. So as I mentioned, if you're going to use an aftermarket spring pack or even just remove leaves from your original spring pack, you need to do something to make up the distance for the leaves that you took out. Now in the back, if you're doing a pickup, it would have had 10 leaves originally. So they use this really thin lower spring clamp. So this goes under here, underneath the back, your cross members up in here, your U-bolts go down through here. This is what clamps up to the bottom. The cars that used 7 and 8 leaves used this. You can see there's a pretty significant difference in the height. So if you're doing a pickup, an easy way to make up some of that gap is using a car lower clamp. These were, like 7 and 8 leaf, I think. So if you're just taking a couple leaves out, you can probably just put this on there and be good. This truck, I think, is, I don't know, going to have 6 or 7 maybe. So this may not take up the entire distance. So I'm going to take some of the old leaves and just cut spacers out of them just to have them on hand so we can, put this thing together quickly when we get the parts we need back for it. Now the front is kind of the same deal. I believe these are all the same. I don't think there was ever any difference in the number of leaves in the front spring. So these are all going to be the same height. You could take a piece of plate and actually build this up. Just drill your hole in the center for your center bolt and make that taller if you wanted to. You can do the same thing with these. I mean, you could take one of these tall ones, add a 1/2-inch piece of plate to it or whatever, and that'll make up some more distance. Just cut it out to this size, weld it on there, and that'll work too. There's a few different ways to do this, but whatever you do, you need to make up that distance so that this isn't hitting the cross member before this hits the spring. So here's what I'm going to do with this. I'm going to wipe that down real quick if I can find a rag. So I'm going to go with a total of 8-inch wide leaf as a spacer. So just set your 4-inch at the center of your center pin hole. Mark it at 8 and mark it at 0. Doesn't have to be exact, it's just close enough as possible. So I got them all cut. Ended up going a little overboard and just decided to cut them all instead of 3 or 4. It's good to have a few extras on hand. So now take all these, hit them with a flap disc real quick, get them cleaned up and ready to go. Now, someone had asked about using a spring spreader on this. I don't personally like them. I know some people use them. I guess they work. I would use it on this where it's just one leaf. I would not use it on a whole assembled spring. I just don't trust them. For something like this where it's just a single leaf, I'm sure they would work just fine. The only downside to them is if you're doing what I'm doing and putting reverse side springs on it, they don't fit reverse side springs unless you make a whole little contraption that hooks underneath and then hooks the top, and it just makes them even more dangerous to use if you do that. So I don't use them. I don't even have one. So this is how I get the single rear leaf off. These aren't super tight, but there's still a fair amount of tension in it. Enough so that you can't just pull the shackles off and pull the spring off by hand like you do with the front, at least not safely anyway. So the way I do it, first off, obviously get your cotter pins and the nuts off of the shackles. Now this is where small pieces of 2x4, one on each side, slide them underneath, just like that. That'll keep this from bouncing down when you're trying to loosen those up, but it also plays an important role later on when we're trying to get this thing all apart. So, wow. Wow, somebody put that thing on there pretty well. Jesus. All right. God damn. What the hell? These don't need to be 300 foot-pounds. Holy crap. Alright. Juice? How about some juice? It's almost empty. There you go. Jesus. Come on. Of course, I don't have an 11/16 ratcheting wrench because whoever designed that set of wrenches decided that no one ever used 11/16, and they have every other size. Man, that is ridiculous. What the hell? That one's not as bad. Wow. I'm guessing whoever installed the flywheel is not the same guy that installed these. Alright, so now that the shackle ends are both undone, You could just get in here with a hammer and a pry bar and stand back and knock one of the shackles out, and that would work. It's a little sketchy, but I would probably avoid that way. The other option is if there's two of you here, one of you can actually kind of jounce down on this thing. The other one can knock the shackle out, and that'll work as well. But right now it's just me, so this is how I do it. Again, 2x4 underneath each end of the shackle, stick it way up in there. That'll make it so the spring can't fold down on the shackles. And the next thing I do is I get this big punch, goes in the center hole there. So I'm getting the ratchet strap, and I'm actually going to put a second one on there just in case. I got to put more tension on it. I don't want it to pop off of there. So do a little safety strip. That way, at least if something happens to one of them, you'll have a backup there. So once you put a little tension on that, you may have to do a few clicks. But you should be able to knock. Yeah, get your face in there, obviously. Should be able to knock that shackle out of there. So these are the new shackles. We're not using metal bushings. These actually have I think they're polyurethane bushings. In order to use these, you need to remove the metal bushings that are in here, just like we did with the front purchase. These absolutely suck to get out of here. This one, we might get lucky. A lot of times they wear out right down in here. As you can see, it's really thin right there. If that's really thin or worn through, then we can probably get this out fairly easily. Otherwise, you have to go in and cut grooves in them like we did with the front ones. And there's not a lot of room in here unless you pull the backing plates off. So that can be kind of tricky. I think it's actually moving. This one's pretty much completely worn through on that side, so it should be pretty easy to get out of there. The downside is that those rods are in the way. I'm going to drive it out this way, I think, if I can get in there. Yeah, look at that. It's yeah, worn right through. Luckily, I didn't wear much into the housing, so that's still good. A lot of times people run these things so long like that, it'll actually wear through this housing, and then it's junk, or you can weld it and forge it and all that good stuff. But this one should be fine. Hopefully the other side's still good too. But that is the easiest one I've ever done. The one I did on the black car took me forever heating this and cutting this, and it's just absolute nightmare getting them out of there. And you can see now these things slide, not easily, but with a little tapping they'll go in there. I don't want to put them in all the way because I'll never really get it out. But so they fit right into that housing pretty well. And that'll give a little bit better ride than the metal ones anyway. So. At least this one I can kind of get on the lip of it. Yeah, I don't think it's even moving. Oh, it is moving. Probably the easiest one I've ever done. Yeah, I'm surprised. Nice. Yeah, that'll work. Thanks.
Is there a front to back or this? There isn't.
No, it's all the same shit. So. I should just pop in there. Hang on to that. Stuff grease in that.
I get it.
It's doing the same thing. Might be easier on the spring. Yeah, probably will be. And before you do that, roll this. Bring it right up like that. Put this in there. Yeah, I mean, you're not going to be able to get it. We're going to have to get it part way on and get the spring over there and then drive it in. So get it somewhat started. That into there.
Get that right.
Yeah. Oh, I should probably do this without my patented ratchet strap idea. Ready?
A little more.
Started. It's got a stamp on one side of it. You may have to. It may be bent.
You're gonna have to push. Push.
That's all I got. Not fat enough.
You might need your ratchet strap.
Yeah. All right. It's a little bit less sketchy now, so.
Good high quality strap there.
That's a nice one. Hang on.
Yep. Yep. Keep going. One more maybe. Close. Yep. Good to go.
Snug it down a little more. I think we're super tight.
Butter.
Some bouncy. That feels good.
Goes down through.
Yep. Before you do that, let's make sure it fits the crossmember. Yours is kind of bunged up, but they don't actually fit. Yeah, they don't fit in the factory crossmembers.
So you just grind the pin or grind the
Well,
hole?
where yours is screwed up, I think I'm gonna grind the hole.
Okay.
Because it's all, because the one they had in there was round.
Yeah.
It's all kind of dinked up, and I think if we file the corners, it'll actually
Okay.
fix that. So we'll do that before we go.
Can we hold the bolt?
Yeah, sure. Might actually work. Yep, perfect. Beautiful. I want this one small around now if you can. Alright. Yeah, get from one to there. Let me grab a 4x4. Sort of. Not really. You got more room? Not really.
Not a lot.
Okay. That'll work, I guess. Alright, so first is this one. Oh, that's a good start. Good.
I don't know how those are supposed to stay in there.
We may have to
Like
get this
silicone?
together and put them in once it's kind of squished down a little bit, because I don't think there's anything to keep them.
Okay.
Yeah, there's nothing to keep that in. Those will probably stay. That's got more of a. This one. That's not long enough to do it this way, but pop that out. Hang on before you stick it.
Yeah, get that other one on there, right?
Yeah, but I also want to get the pucks in there. These I don't think we'd be able to